brain processes and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the goal. So we'll have our foundation between week 1 and 2 as we go into our other topics for the course. So that's kind of the goal we have. All right, I got our recording going. So I am going to go ahead and bring up what we stopped with yesterday. Okay. So psychology really grew out of the study of philosophy and the idea of, what is existence, what is the purpose of human beings, of animals, and what is ethics, what is morals, all of those questions that typically philosophy takes a look at and tries to examine. When psychology came about, it decided that it wanted to take on more of an objective method of studying different ideas of what the mind is specifically, and individual behavior and mental processes. But with it, it took on some of because we were the study of the mind. Um, we did take some of the philosophical questions with us. Now, the things that I would state at this point, and I think it's kind of important, is none of these philosophical problems have definitively been solved. We still have arguments for one or the other, or a blending of both of them. But these philosophical arguments really have not been resolved in a solidified, if you want to think about it, we don't have a physics equation that explains it, as you would say. Okay. The other thing that I would say is that while we're taking from the Western culture perspective that built into this idea, these ideas have been a philosophical or a theological, if you want to put it that, or religious argument across cultures. And we're actually going to end this philosophical section with a elder Tana Otham's person's perspective on these different arguments. So we'll end with a Tana Otham philosophy. So I just wanted to express that as we go into these. The other thing that I would like to say before I get deeper into this is I'm giving a very, very simplistic view of these arguments. If any of these arguments you kind of like, I'm really interested in that, I would encourage you to do a deeper dive into them, because the arguments that I'm really doing a very simple version of each of these arguments of the nature of human beings and the mind-body problem and whatnot. So kind of keep that in mind as well. Okay. So the first problem that we'll talk about, and these are put on the same slide because the mind-body problem and the nature-nurture problem are really related in some ways, as we will see as we look at these two arguments, okay? But the first one is nature versus nurture, okay? And this basic idea is what gives way to much of our behavior, our personality, the way we think. Is it nature, meaning what we're born with, what we inherited? In modern terms, we would say our genetics. Or is it because of our experience and our lived experience, or the way we were nurtured with our parents and socialized and the experiences we had? And this is the nurture argument, okay? To kind of give this philosophical argument, we'll go back to the Greek times with two individuals known as Plato and Aristotle, okay? Plato and Aristotle was students of Socrates, which was kind of his name is big in philosophy because he came up with what's called the Socratic method. Okay, If any of you go to law school, this is one of the main things that you'll learn when you're doing a trial, okay? Because what the Socratic method is that you have a back and forth conversation until you reach the ultimate truth, okay? So you continue to question a person and they question you back, and it's this back and forth until you reach the truth, okay? Now, Plato and Aristotle were Socrates' kind of star students, as you would say. And when Socrates passed away, Plato and Aristotle, they were sure that the school would go to them, that Socrates' school would go to one or the other. But what happened is that Socrates gave his school to Plato and not Aristotle. Okay. Um, and there's a lot of debate about this because what we know about Socrates comes from Plato's writings. So there's a lot of questions behind what really happened in that, but that's for a philosophy class, not necessarily for us to debate. Okay, but what happened is Plato stayed with the Socrates school, became the head, whatnot. Aristotle over time became very dissatisfied with it, and he left. Okay, um, now let's go down Aristotle's road for a while. Is what he did is when he left the school, he went and taught people like Alexander the Great, and he was very much what you would call a naturalist, meaning that he really kind of established some of the scientific methods that we still use today when we go out and we observe things in the natural world. Okay. He was one of the first to classify plants and animals into their different classifications. That's why when you read about different plants and what, they have Latin names for them because was originally established. The phenology was established during Aristotle's time. Okay. Um, Plato, on the other hand, stayed, and he stayed within the cities of Greece. And they're going, because of their human experiences, they're going to come to a very different conclusion about the nature and nurture of human beings. Okay. Plato is going to see that there is very much a caste system in the world. Okay. There are the working poor, the indigent, the merchant class, the construction class, the upper class, and then the royalty. Okay. And he's going to note that, uh, especially during his time, what a person was born in really set their who they were going to become. Okay. And so he argued that we are born to become who we were born to be. So if we were born to be a merchant, that's what we would become. Um, and so he believed that it was completely our inheritance, our bloodline, that determines who we become and how we become who we are. Okay. Now, this did have a huge influence on Western society, especially royalty. This is where you get the idea that you need to marry royal blood in order to stay royal. This is where the king needs to have a son because they need to keep that bloodline going. Okay. And so the idea of royalty and people of better blood or better natures and whatnot all comes from the ideas, at least in Western ideas, through until we get to the democratic systems that people are born into who they're supposed to be. Okay. Aristotle is going to see something very different. And I'm going to put Aristotle's philosophy in a very simple term. Okay. He recognized that if you put a plant where they don't get enough sun, they don't get enough water, they don't get enough nutrients, they die. But when you put a plant in the right place with the right sun, with the right water, they flourish. So he argued that humans are much like plants and trees and even animals who have their areas of success, that it's really nurture, it's the environment that shapes us into who we are. Okay. And so it's very much, if we're not in the right nurturing environment, we tend to fail. If we're in the right nurturing environment, we tend to succeed. Okay. And so he's going to come up with this idea that it's less about what we're born with, but it's more about our human experiences and what we experience in the world. Okay. All right. So real quickly, let's fast forward a couple thousand years to today. Where are we currently with this debate? Okay. Well, if we take it from a genetic perspective, we are at the state where we realize that it's a combination of our genetics and our experience. But determining exactly how much is due to genetics versus experience is really difficult. And I'll give you an example of personality. And so is your personality what you were born with and what your parents gave to you, or is it because of your experiences and what you have done? Well, we use something called the genetic component or genetic quotient, excuse me. And what this genetic quotient is it's a percentage of how much is due to nature versus nurture, using identical twin studies where identical twins were separated at birth and raised in two separate environments. And the idea is because they're genetically similar, there any similarities in personality and intelligence level and whatnot should be due to genetics, not versus nurture. It shouldn't, and so that's kind of the idea that we have. Okay. So the issue though is when it comes to, for example, personality, it really depends on the study you read. Okay. Currently, uh, the percentage of your personality that is determined by your genetics is somewhere between 20% to 60%, dependent upon the study you read. Okay. And so, as you can note, just in the idea of personality, that it's very variable, and we really haven't really got down to a very precise calculation about how much is due to inheritance versus how much is due to nurturance. Um, and again, we will come back to this issue when we get into intelligence level. How much of your intelligence is determined by genetics versus experience? We'll look at this from a classroom experience when we get into developmental psychology. We'll get into this when we get to abnormal psychology, and we'll talk about, well, is a neurodevelopment disorder like autism or attention deficit disorder, is this something that we should say is a deficit, or if it's something that we should say should be uh, uh, what we call neurodivergence or neurodiversity, and should be seen as something normal because this is what nature is kind of doing to our population as far as growth and development. So we'll come back to this argument. I would encourage you to consider what way you kind of lean on these kind of issues, whether you feel like who you are is more about your life experiences, or who you are is more about your genetics and what you were born in. And we will see that both of them actually will become very important. But as from a scientific perspective, the importance can vary dependent upon, again, the studies you read. Okay. So we go from nature to nurture to the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem comes down to the notion of what's called dualism or monoism. Okay. Dualism states that the mind and the body are two separate entities. Okay. Meaning that we have this thing that is separate from our body that then provides influence on the body on how it operates. Okay. Monoism is the notion of the mind and the body is one and the same, that there isn't a separation between minds and bodies. Okay. And so, again, looking at some philosophies, we can look at Descartes and Locke, a French philosopher versus an English philosopher, if you want to put it in these minds. And I should note that Descartes was actually commissioned to solve this problem from a philosophical perspective. The issue is that he was commissioned by the Catholic Church at the time, and you kind of can guess maybe that how he was pressured into his conclusion that he came up with. Because Descartes is going to be the famous person who will be the advocate for dualism, that the mind and the body are two separate entities. Okay. And he's going to use this simple argument. Descartes was one of the first to kind of come up with how our body works. And he believed it happens on a hydraulic level, that what our blood vessels do and whatnot are actually, they contract the body just like a hydraulic system does when it gets pressure versus not pressure. Okay. And his argument, and again, this is a very simple version of this. His argument really comes from his experience walking through some German gardens. And in these German gardens, they had statues where that if you stepped on a certain brick in the pathway, it would create a hydraulic system to where the statue would start to move. Okay. And so what he believed is because the body is a physical entity, that it has to have something to act upon it in order for it to operate. Just like in the German gardens, if there wasn't some external entity pushing on the brick, the statue would not move independent of itself. Okay. So he believed that the mind, or if you want to put it in theological or religious terms, the soul is separate from the body because a physical body needs something to operate on it in order for it to move and to exist. Now, interestingly, he did put the mind, the location of the mind in the pituitary gland, which, as most of you, I hope, know, actually regulates hormone levels. So I think his idea of where it was located and where the mind is was a little bit off. But he came up with this argument that in order for the body to move, experience the world the way it does, it has to have some type of external energy or soul or mind to operate upon it. Okay. Now, on the other side of the argument is John Locke. Okay. And John Locke, I should say that if Thomas Jefferson submitted the Declaration of Independence as a paper for this class, I would have to give him, I would have to report him to the dean for academic dishonesty, okay? Because the majority of the Declaration of Independence comes directly from John Locke's treatise on government, okay? Where he states very clearly that we are all created equal. He did say under the eyes of God, and that's what gives us the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he went a step further and he said, from a philosophical perspective, how are we all born equal if, according to Plato, we're born differently based on our blood or our genetics, or based on Descartes' idea that there's some external entity that is operating on the system, that there's already a pre-established existence that is operating upon the body and the brain. Okay. And so what he argued is a mononistic system, that we're all born with blank slates. If I were to put it in modern terms, we are all born with blank hard drives, which is going to align again, going back to the nature nurture argument, for which experience writes upon, meaning that he's not only going to say there is no separation between the mind and the body, there can't be if we're all born equal, but it is experience that then starts to create who we are. And that's what creates the diversity of people in the world, because we all experience the world differently. Okay, so there is no pre-programming, there is no ideas. Now, this does get more complicated. He does kind of, which we might get into when we get to developmental psychology, there are some pre-things that do exist, but they're among all of us. Okay, so that is the simplistic version of the mind-body problem coming from Descartes and John Locke. What do we say today? Okay, well, as brain science develops more and more and more, there are a lot more psychologists, and especially neuropsychologists and neuroscientists, that are going more on the mononistic end, that there is no real separation between the mind and the body, because the mind is the brain, and the brain is a physical organ within the body that is operating the body. So there is, so on a purely, if you take a purely neurological perspective, once the brain is dead, the body is dead. And so how can there be a soul, or how can there be a something that exists beyond just the operations of the brain? And there can, and again, there's lots of evidence that suggests that yes, when certain areas of the brain die, we lose capacities in certain ways. And so there is growing evidence for that mononistic argument. Okay. However, however, there's also limitations to a purely neurological interpretation. Okay. Because what synapses and brain areas and activity in the brain cannot tell us is how we experience the world. Okay. So, for example, if we look at it from a computer system, we can maybe understand the brain as a CPU, the computer operating system. That, yeah, when a certain part of the CPU gets broken, then we stop experiencing certain parts of our computer. Okay. However, the argument that maybe we still do have a mind body is because when we look at it from the study of consciousness, which we'll get to in week 3, one of the issues that comes out of the study of consciousness is, while we can see all this electrical activity in the brain, the question remains, is where is the video screen and the speakers of our computer analogy system? And who is viewing that computer screen and those speakers? Okay, so while we can see the brain activity, and we can see that when you lose certain parts of functioning within that system, that you start losing experiences, the question still remains, is who is viewing that screen? Because we haven't located our screen, and we haven't located what you're hearing when you're listening to this lecture or looking at these slides. So there's still quite a ways for the mononistic neurologist to go or neuroscientist to go because they haven't located the speaker system and the video screen system within our conscious world. Okay. So on a very deep level, there is still an argument that can be made for the separation between the mind and the body, even when evidence from the physical aspects of the brain are showing more of a monistic argument that the mind and the body are not separate in uh, um, caliber. And again, as we go through this class, we will recognize that the mind and the body are very much connected. Even if they may be two separate entities, they rely on each other and they have mutual influence on each other, as we will see as we get through some of our topics while we go through the class. Okay. All right. One of the last classical problems that psychology has kind of taken on is what is known as the nature of man. Okay. Is man born selfish, self-centered, if you want to use the term narcissistic, self-destructive? In other words, is man born bad, if we want to use that term to encompass all of those things? Or is human beings born helpful, altruistic, nurturing, or we'll use the term good, okay? And we'll use two philosophers to look at these because these two philosophers actually had a huge influence on criminal justice systems and the justifications for governments, okay? The first one is Hobbes, and the second one is Rousseau. Okay, uh, John Hobbes, and again, I'm going to put this in very simple terms. Both of these philosophers are going to look to nature and look at what nature does to determine what the nature of men are, what the nature of human beings are. And they're both going to look, and again, I'm putting this in very, very simple terms. They're both going to look at nature and see something totally different. Hobbes is going to look at the world and he's going to see a very destructive thing. He's going to see volcanoes destroying forests and communities. He's going to see hurricanes as a destructive force, wildfires. He's going to see how prey and and hunters have an offensive, destructive force on each other. And he's going to look at the world and says the world is a destructive, self-gratifying system that the natural tendency of human beings is the same, that we have a destructive nature about us. Okay. Rousseau is going to look at nature and he's going to see something very different. He's going to see how volcanoes create regrowth. It creates new land. It's what establishes new properties. He's going to see wildfires and how after wildfires, new growth starts. And how while prey is hunted, when prey is eaten, it then goes into the ground and then nurtures its next. And they're going to see this beautiful cycle between hunter and prey. Um, and so he's going to look at the world and go, nature is good as long as the person, the human being, stays within nature in its natural state. Okay. And Rousseau is going to go a little bit further and say men become destructive, humans become destructive when they deviate from nature, when they deviate from these beautiful cycles of death and growth and regeneration. Okay. All right. So I mentioned that both of these individuals had huge influences on criminal justice, and governmental systems. Because what political individuals are going to do, what political philosophers are going to do here in the United States and Great Britain or the United Kingdom is they're going to take Hobbes' perspective that because the nature of humans is bad, the purpose of government, the purpose of society is to control that self-centered, destructive nature of its populations. Okay. And so you probably heard the more polite term here in the United States that we're a society of law and order. Okay. Because if we don't have law and order, we will act in a destructive manner. Okay. This then also lends to what do we do with people who are bad? While the natural tendency of the world is to punish it, is to shame it, is to take it away from the community and isolate those individuals so they no longer can have an influence on their community. Hence, you probably recognize that's basically our criminal justice system. Now, there are some reforms going on that are positive, but that's basically the idea that once you have disobeyed the laws of the land, you are marked and you are punished. Okay. Now, Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands are going to take Rousseau's idea. And they're going to take this idea that if someone becomes deviant, that we need to bring them back into nature, back into the community, back into their natural state of being. Okay. So while if you go to a prison here in the United States, it's going to be a 5 by 10 cell, maybe with a metal toilet and a mattress. When you go to a prison, for example, in Denmark, it's more like going to the Ritz Hotel. It's very plush, very comfortable, very healing, as you would say. And what you get there is you get support and you get counseling and you get therapy and you get the opportunity to be integrated into the community. Okay. So I just want to give this very broad perspective on how we should really look at these different ideas and have them influence our social systems. So what is more successful at creating healing environments? Is it these systems? Is it these systems or the systems more in our Nordic countries? And one way we could look at this is recidivism rates, okay? Meaning the most basic measure of recidivism is the probability that a person will reoffend and end up back in the prison system after their first offense, okay? And what we see is a very stark difference. When we look at the countries like Great Britain and the United States that took on the Hobbesian philosophy, recidivism rates are around 60%, meaning that a person has a 60% chance of reoffending once they leave the prison the first go around, okay? But what about in the Nordic countries? Their recidivism rates are around about 11%, okay? Meaning that after going to a healing environment, the chances of them coming back are about 1 in 10 versus 6 in 10, okay? So Why am I bringing this up at this point is because throughout this class, we're going to look at this debate a lot when we get to, for example, um, 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 oh, one of the first kind of theoretical aspects, which is psychoanalysis done by Sigmund Freud. He's going to argue that we do have this self-destructive and destructive force that does determine a lot of our behaviors and our outcomes. When we get to social psychology, we'll look at this idea that we have kind of this ability to determine whether we act good or whether we act bad, but it is something that is much more determined by the situation a person finds themselves in. Okay. And again, we'll look at it when we get to abnormal psychology and all of these different areas. And we'll see that this idea of a person being a good person or a bad person is much more complex than simply, are we all born with this evil nature or this good nature? And what we'll probably end up arguing by the end of the class is that we all have the potential to be good or bad, dependent upon the situation that we find ourselves in. But we'll get to that as we move forward. So I do want to kind of just take a quick pause. I won't stop the recording or stop the screen. Paige, yes, they actually uphold rehabilitation. Thank you for that comments. At this moment, with these three philosophical arguments, I've given a very broad perspective on them, but is there any questions or comments on these three philosophies that we've went over so far? Thank you, Michael. All right, thank you. All right, looking like we're good to go. So I think what I want to do for, you know what, let me look. I'm going to take a look. Let's see how much we have. Actually, yeah, I do want to hit on this first. So sorry about that. Yeah, we'll get this done. And then I think we'll save the rest for Monday. Um, yeah, because that's getting in. Okay. So I think what we'll do for today, gang, is just so we don't confuse these ideas, is I do want to maybe just end today's class with an awesome philosophy. Now, I want to be very careful about saying this represents all Tana Otham people or all Native Americans in the Southwest or whatnot. Because one thing that I would encourage you to do, if you're interested in understanding um, um, what your philosophy is, given your Native American heritage and perspectives on land, I would urge you to go talk to either your elders or individuals who study your indigenous belief systems. Okay. Um, because this is just one philosophy, and I can go to a lot of other elders and hear something different. So I just want to bring this one up. This this philosophy comes from he passed within the last year. His name is Camillus Lopez, and he had a huge influence on Tana Otham Community College. Many of you have probably seen maybe some, yeah, at least in your science class, the man in the maze model that he came up with. And he was very much one of our top educators when it comes to Tana Otham philosophy and Tana Otham history at the college. And one time I asked him about these problems. And so this is his kind of interpretation of these different problems that we talked about. One, he argued that from his understanding of Tanaha's history and philosophy, that when it comes to good and evil, we all have the tendency for both. And he used the example of the Bon, or translated in English, the coyote, as an example, because historically in the oral traditions of the Tanaha's, the coyote represented both a deviant individual, like he liked to create chaos among the Tanaha's people, but at the same time, if he saw trouble, he would also come to the community's help. So there was this dual nature within the coyote, according to Professor Lopez. Okay, and so he felt that we have this duality, duplicity of life, to either do good or evil, or at least create some trouble once in a while. Okay. And then when it came to the whole mind-body aspect, and the whole are we born with, or are we born with a soul or spirit or genetics, he actually separated it into three aspects of the true self. Okay. He very much believed that, yes, we do have a physical body that navigates the world and tells us about what our world is like. Without the physical body, we wouldn't be able to experience nature. We wouldn't be able to interact with nature or interact with each other and communicate and do all of those things. So the physical body is a necessity. But he believed that there's actually a separation between the mind and the soul or spirit. Okay. He believed that the mind is how we construct knowledge to exist here in the world. That we have, if you want to think about it, the brain is here to make it so that we can navigate our physical world and navigate our social world and whatnot. But these two things exist within our world, within our physical world. Okay. But he also stated that we have a soul or spirit that actually goes beyond our physical body and our mind. That we have something that once where we're no longer here continues to exist beyond the physical world. Okay, so is there a dualistic aspect in this philosophy? Yes, because there's this idea that we have this kind of energy that transcends our physical world and transcends just our human experiences. But there's also a monistic view in his philosophy, in that we do have this physical mind and this physical body that allows us to navigate our physical world. Okay. So again, I wanted to bring this up because we really looked at a very Western perspectives on this, and I wanted to provide kind of more of a more Native American, indigenous view. And I found this one very intriguing because it actually kind of combines all of these philosophies that we talked about, making the physical world very important in our experiences, but also these ideas of different tendencies, and the idea of a soul or a spirit. So I just wanted to bring this one up as an example of a different idea of nature and nurture and all of those different arguments. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to stop our sharing for today. All right. I'm going to ask again, is there any final questions? I think we'll just have to save the rest for next week. I think it might be a little too much to start and then restart again this coming Monday. So is there any questions about today, about the class, about the syllabus, about anything before we close up today and agree that